Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with debunking the modal ontological argument for the existence of God 6 ways from Sunday. In this video we're going to be looking back at Inspiring Philosophy's version of the modal ontological argument. We're going to look at some responses Inspiring Philosophy has offered to some common objections to the modal ontological argument, and then I will offer my own objections to his responses, if that makes sense. So, the objections that he's going to respond to are the omnipotence paradox, the logical problem of evil, the problem of imperfection, empirical evidence, reverse ontological argument, maximally great physical beings, and other maximally great beings. In order to show how ridiculous this argument is on the face of it, I'm not just going to respond to a couple of these objections. I'm going to respond to all of his responses to these objections. If one of those objections succeeds, the modal ontological argument fails. But just to be safe, I'll respond to every single one. Let's take a look. So, the first one, I'm actually just going to offer a link to one of my videos because I've responded to this before. This is the omnipotence paradox. Basically, I'm going to, in that video, it was part of my 12 Days of Theology series, I'm going to show the paradox, I'm going to show the common response, which is the response that he offers here, and then I'm going to offer a further objection that shows that the solution to the omnipotence paradox just moves the goalpost. That's objection number 7. The logical problem of evil. This is another subject that I've done a number of videos on. I have a video on the problem of evil, the free will defense, and then I have 2 different objections to the free will defense. That's going to be the free will dilemma and the partial free will argument. Objection number 8, the free will dilemma. Check it out. Basically, it's saying that the free will defense and the solution to the Euthyphro dilemma are incompatible. And the partial free will argument. God could have given us partial free will and made the world a better place. Objections 8 and 9. Number 3, the problem of imperfection. This is an argument I haven't really seen and I haven't done a video on, so I'll address it here. This is the argument: God is perfect. God cannot create imperfection. The world is imperfect. Therefore, God does not exist. The responses that Inspiring Philosophy is going to offer are as follows. The world is secretly perfect. It's something of a theodicy telling us a story of, well, actually there's a reason for all of this suffering. I would respond with the evidential problem of evil. It seems to me that actually the world is a pretty horrible place. There's a lot of suffering that goes on in the world. There's a lot of frightening and horrible things that are going on. And just because you may only experience pretty good things doesn't mean that there's not a lot of really nasty things happening in the world that God's theodicy doesn't really have a good way to explain away. That's objection number 10, the evidential problem of evil. Next, he says that the world only became imperfect when sin entered. It seems to me that the Garden of Eden was far from perfect and a very confusing place if we are to think that we would never die there and everything was a vegetarian. I'm actually not going to offer one of my videos in defense of this objection. I'm going to give you one of Dark Matter's because I think it's not only humorous, but does the objection quite a lot of justice. Check out that objection. That's objection number 11. The Garden of Eden was imperfect. Now, number 4 on our objections to the modal ontological argument is to demand empirical evidence. I actually think that Inspiring Philosophy does a really good job of responding to this. The statement that all statements require empirical evidence itself requires no empirical evidence in favor of it and can get no empirical evidence in favor of it. So, to demand that everything we see requires empirical evidence seems to be a little confusing and seems to be problematic. However, I think that there's a better objection hiding here. It's where we just demand evidence. Once again, we have yet to see a substantial reason to believe premise number 1, so I'm a little worried by that. I want to demand just some evidence. It doesn't have to be empirical, just give me evidence. Give me a reason you think this belief in 1 is justified. That's, once again, going back to objection 6. There's no reason to accept premise 1 of the ontological argument. Now, the reverse ontological argument. This is another one we're going to deal with here in a little bit more depth. The reverse ontological argument goes as follows. It is possible that God, a maximally great being, does not exist. If it is possible that God does not exist, then he does not exist in some possible worlds. That just is the definition of possibility. If God does not exist in some possible worlds, then God does not exist in all possible worlds. The reason that happens is God, being a maximally great being, is not contingent. If he exists in any possible world, he exists in all possible worlds, and if he doesn't exist in any possible world, then he exists in no possible worlds. If God does not exist in all possible worlds, then God, a maximally great being, does not exist in the actual world. Therefore, if God does not exist in the actual world, then God does not exist. Basically, all we're doing is switching out God existing with God not existing, and it seems that this is equally logically valid, and once again, we're only going to have to defend premise 1. Here, I'm a little worried. Inspiring philosophy is actually going to object to premise 2, which simply doesn't make sense, and say that a maximally great being is not impossible. Well, wait a second. That's not what this premise is saying. This premise is just defining possibility. It's explaining what it means if something is possible. Even said this in his original video, that these premises that follow are just logical implications from our original premise at the top. This is not what this premise is saying. It's just the definition of possibility. If it is possible that X does not exist, then X does not exist in some possible worlds. It's the definition of possibility, and it's objection number 12. If you reject P2 of the reverse, then you are rejecting the definition of possibility. What he really wants to object to, because I want to be charitable, is premise number 1. It is possible that God, a maximally great being, does not exist. The claim a maximally great being is not impossible would actually go against this premise, because this premise is going to imply the idea that a maximally great being is impossible. However, we can have an argument for God being impossible. It runs like the normal ontological argument. It is possible that God does not exist. Can you imagine a world where God doesn't exist? If you can, you have to accept that premise. If God does exist, he exists in all possible worlds. This is just what you said earlier about God being maximally great. Therefore, a maximally great being is impossible simply because it is possible that he doesn't exist in a world. He is not contingent by your own definition. So, if he doesn't exist in one possible world, he doesn't exist in any possible world. That's objection number 13. A maximally great being is impossible via the ontological argument's own justification. Perhaps you're seeing why this argument itself is a little worrisome. It should be clear that a theist wouldn't accept A and B. Similarly, how an atheist wouldn't accept A and B of the original argument. It's just going to automatically imply that whatever you don't believe, either that God exists or God doesn't exist, is incorrect. Once again, we're objecting to this first premise. It is possible that God, a maximally great being, does not exist by saying a maximally great being is not impossible. This is just a denial of that first premise. This is the exact same argument that atheists would offer against the ontological argument. It doesn't show that either of them are more valid. It in fact shows that neither are. What this is showing is if the reverse ontological argument is not convincing to you as a theist, that's the reason that the ontological argument, the modal ontological argument, is not convincing to any atheist. Why? Because the atheist will just deny that first premise, just like you're doing right here of denying the first premise of the reverse. Unless you offer some justification for your denial. Let's take a look. So, a maximally great being is not impossible. How are we going to support this? Well, impossible things are things that are logical contradictions, things we could not imagine. We can imagine a maximally great being. A maximally great being, therefore, is not a logical contradiction, so a maximally great being is not impossible. Seems to follow. The problem is, we can do the same thing with necessary. A maximally great being is not necessary. That's what we want to conclude. Necessary things are things whose denial is a logical contradiction. We couldn't imagine denying those things. However, we can imagine a world without a maximally great being. Therefore, the denial of a maximally great being is not a logical contradiction. Therefore, a maximally great being is not necessary. If a maximally great being isn't impossible and isn't necessary, that means a maximally great being is in fact contingent. That is just a denial of the second one of those premises of our original ontological argument, or 1b in this version. And it's a denial of the argument still, even if you can have that he's not impossible, you're going to end up denying that he's not contingent. That's objection number 14. The ontological argument implies God is contingent via this explanation. Also, it's important to note there's a difference between a maximally great being is not impossible and a maximally great being has not been shown to be impossible. Just because we haven't shown something to be impossible yet doesn't mean that it's not actually impossible. This is called the appeal to ignorance fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. It's going to be objection 15. There's a difference between claiming something is not impossible and claiming that something has yet to be shown that it is impossible. However, maybe we can back up this claim, and it's with something called the modal perfection argument. This argument attempts to actually give a foundational backing up of premise 1. Fantastic, we've been looking for that all along. This modal perfection argument is the deep idea behind the modal ontological argument for the existence of God. It's pretty complicated and technical. I'm going to handle it in the next video, not here, because we need to move on, because we are growing excessively verbose here. Next up, a maximally great physical being. The argument is going to go as follows. It is possible that a maximally great unicorn exists. If it is possible that a unicorn exists, then he exists in some possible worlds. If a maximally great unicorn exists in some possible worlds, then a maximally great unicorn exists in all possible worlds. If a maximally great unicorn exists in all possible worlds, then a maximally great unicorn exists in the actual world. If a maximally great unicorn exists in the actual world, then a maximally great unicorn exists. Basically, all we've done is put in unicorn for being and tried to get that God is in some way physical. It's important to note that this isn't actually really an objection that's been put to the modal ontological argument. What this is inspiring philosophy attempting to kind of push his own agenda of idealism and the sense that beings are not necessarily physical, that in fact they're going to be mental. This is going to be his objection to this one. So, there's a maximally great physical being. Physical beings require space to exist. Cosmology tells us that the universe once existed as a singularity. Physical beings could not exist as a singularity. Therefore, physical beings cannot be maximally great. So, the maximal great being has to be something that's mental, therefore idealism, or at least substance dualism. If you didn't understand that, don't worry about it. I'm kind of just trying to give the underlying reasons for why he's giving this argument. So, cosmology tells us the universe once existed as a singularity. I'm a little concerned by this. Objection 16. Science is plagued by the problem of induction. I've got a couple videos on it. Check it out. Objection 17. Cosmology, as far as sciences go, is even worse at this than anyone else. Cosmology assumes something called the cosmological principle. It's a whopper of an unjustified assumption, and it's just the only way they can do what they want to do in cosmology is to assume this. They don't really have a good reason to. That's objection number 17. Number 3, a physical being cannot exist at a singularity. I'm a little concerned by this. Why? Have you ever tested this claim? Have you gone to a singularity and tested it out? We know next to nothing about what is actually inside a singularity. How can you know, then, that a mental being can exist at a singularity? If a physical being can't, it seems that possibly maybe a mental being can't even exist at a singularity. How do you know any of these things? There seems to be zero justification behind this premise. And objection number 20, how can you claim to know where beings can and cannot exist when we have yet to prove that other people exist, let alone ourselves? We cannot know that someone across the way from us actually exists, or at least their consciousness exists, or exists in the way that this idealism is going to kind of want to exist. It seems to be problematic. The problem with this objection is it goes beyond the scope of the ontological argument. This response is trying to not only prove that God exists, but prove that an idea of God exists, or God in some mental sense exists. Because that's kind of inspiring philosophy's underlying project here. It's outside the modal ontological argument. It's not even an ontological argument because it's using experience to do it. Not good at all. Finally, other maximally great beings. Two maximally great beings are a contradiction, therefore there's only one God. Inspiring philosophy thinks this is actually a point for him, it's actually a point against him. I'll show in a future video that the ontological argument actually implies that there are two or more maximally great beings. And, as you say, maximally great beings are a contradiction if there's more than one. Therefore, the ontological argument implies a contradiction and should be rejected. That's objection number 21. The ontological argument implies a contradiction. Finally, he takes a look at the idea of a cosmic sadist, a maximally evil being. We have no experience of someone being evil just to be evil. Therefore, it is impossible for someone to be evil just for the sake of being evil. This is the objection he offers to this idea. Clearly, this is the fallacy of appeal to ignorance. Once again, just because you have not experienced it doesn't mean it's logically impossible. Simply because you have not experienced someone who does evil just for the sake of being evil doesn't mean that they don't exist. And he also goes on to define evil as the pursuit of good in the wrong way. This is a really worrying definition for me. Why? Objection 23, natural evil. How is a hurricane that kills and tortures millions of people doing good in the wrong way? That doesn't make sense to me. And objection 24, what is the wrong way? The evil way or the way that produces evil? That's circular logic. Or if not, give me an answer to Moore's open question. If you don't know what that is, check out my video on it. Finally, evil cannot exist alone. Here's my argument. Pain is bad. Pain can exist without pleasure. Therefore, evil can exist without good. That's objection 25. Evil can exist without good. That was the objections to the responses to the objections to the modal ontological argument offered by Inspiring Philosophy. Next up, we're going to take a look at the modal perfection argument, that argument that I kind of pushed to the side and said was a little more complicated. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.